and ask ourselves which assumptions from the past hold today. How will the future demand different efforts from the United States than before? What do we need to do differently than we have done in the past? And so to address these questions and other ones as well, we're very pleased this morning to host Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri. Senator Hawley's been thinking deeply about U.S. foreign policy, the assumptions behind it, and how the emergence of great power competition should and even must change America's approach. Senator Josh Hawley took office in January 2019 after serving as Missouri's Attorney General. He's the youngest senator in the United States Senate and serves on the Armed Services Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and the Homeland Security Committee. In his time in Congress, Senator Hawley has emerged as a major voice in the debates over policy toward China, including on the issue of Hong Kong, on technology issues, and on an array of national security issues more broadly. So we are delighted to have him at CNES, and I'd ask you to join me in welcoming Senator Josh Hawley.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me. It's great to be back at CNAS. It's great to be with you this morning. My theme today is America's relationship with the world. And as any student of American history knows, that relationship has always been unusual because we are an unusual nation. We were the first colony to break from its parent country. We were the first republic of the modern era and the first republic in history to be governed by a middle class. We were, in short, a revolutionary nation. And all these years later, we live by that revolution still. And this revolutionary Republican heritage has shaped all our dealings with the world beyond. For our first century, we ventured not abroad in search of monsters to destroy, to paraphrase John Quincy Adams. In fact, we ventured not abroad much at all. And even today, the American public is rightly skeptical of open-ended commitments and rightly tired of endless wars. And yet, we have rarely been content as a status quo power. We have long sought to make the world different, better, safer for our republic and for our way of life. Now we find ourselves at a new crossroads to an uncertain future. The long twilight struggle that defined American foreign policy for half a century has been over now for half as long. But the long-promised end of history has not yet arrived. Almost 30 years ago, George H.W. Bush spoke eloquently of a new world order in the aftermath of the Cold War, a new era of universal liberal values. Instead, at this hour, we find ourselves embroiled in the longest war in our nation's history with no discernible end in sight, frequently at odds with our European allies over matters small and large, divided at home, searching for purpose abroad. And all the while, the greatest threat to our nation's security in decades rises in the form of a martial and expansionist China. And it is my argument to you today that our present foreign policy consensus, the cast of mind and expectations embraced by both major parties for the last 20 years, is not adequate to our time, and it is not right for our future. This consensus has left us distracted from the dangers at hand. It has left us unprepared for the challenges we face, and it has been rejected by the people of this country. I'm talking about the consensus that I will call progressive universalism, the consensus of the New World Order, built around American hegemony and the goal of extending multilateral, rules-based patterns of cooperation to the entire international system. This consensus expected the steady expansion of progressive ideas, progressive institutions, and progressive values worldwide. And both of our major political parties embraced this vision, though in different guises. The American left emphasized the expansion of multilateral institutions and decision-making. They prioritized cooperative bodies like NATO and the United Nations and stressed international norms and international law as the building blocks of a progressive global order. Their version of the Universalist project saw the United States as indispensable, yes, but it also regarded American unilateral action as something to be avoided, even a danger. And so left-leaning universalists pushed to integrate the United States more deeply into multilateral bodies and patterns of cooperation. Their aim has been to use American influence to expand a network of norms and rules-based partnerships around the globe. On this approach, the international system would come to look more like America, and America would become inseparably bound to the international system. American conservatives, on the other hand, took a somewhat different lesson from the end of the Cold War. If the left came to believe that everyone around the world shared the same values, then the right concluded that everyone could share our values, and should. For many conservatives, this meant building a world of democracies. And this ambition required, in turn, a willingness to force changes in hostile regimes, to attempt to democratize whole regions and cultures, while preserving the ability of our government to act on its own. Conservatives have not fundamentally disagreed with their counterparts on the left about the ultimate goal of creating a progressive international system. It's just that they doubted it could be realized through multilateral institutions. At the end of the day, conservatives didn't trust anyone to get the job done but America. And for this reason, many conservatives embraced unilateralism and defended the projection of American hard power. The differences between left and right on how precisely to achieve the Universalist vision and how precisely to arrange its features have led to fights that are by now all too familiar. Unilateralism versus multilateralism, the proper jurisdiction of international tribunals. But in the decades since the Cold War, right and left together have steadily expanded American commitments, have steadily expanded America's military footprint, have steadily expanded America's military involvement in every theater of the globe, in all manner of projects, from election monitoring to punitive airstrikes to humanitarian aid. And it is this consensus of left and right together that deserves fresh scrutiny. More than that, it deserves replacement. The universal progressive international order never fully arrived because it was never fully rooted in reality. The unipolar moment at the Cold War's end was bound to pass, and it has. That moment was an aberration, a triumphant one, of course, but one that offers no roadmap for our foreign policy today. And most of the world never signed up for the Universalist project to begin with. Neither Russia nor China, for example, ever agreed to play the part assigned to them. Meanwhile, the pursuit of the Universalist dream left the United States without a clear strategic focus, but with metastasizing commitments that had been paid for in the dearly earned dollars of the American working class and in the dearly precious lives of American soldiers. And let's not forget, as we honor our veterans one day after Veterans Day, who these soldiers are. They are drawn overwhelmingly from middle and working class families and from families with a history of military service. The burden of this nation's long wars has fallen on these Americans, and this country cannot continue to ask them to fight on without a clear purpose and without clear priorities. And so it is time for a new departure, based on America's needs in this new century. Because the point of American foreign policy should not be to remake the world, but to keep Americans safe and prosperous. And those aims are in service to a higher one, to preserve, to protect, to defend our unique American way of democracy. We are a Republican nation, the first of its kind in history, and it is time we pursued a foreign policy in keeping with that national character and the national interests that character defines. And so we should begin here with America's history and America's character. We were the first republic in the world founded on the political power of a middle class. Though the rights of suffrage were too narrow at our founding and the rights of citizenship were unjustly constricted, still, the United States was never governed by an ancestral aristocracy. This country was founded for the middle of society by the class of independent workmen and artisans and farmers. They were the ones who supported the revolution and sent their sons to die for it. They were the ones who ratified our Constitution, and that Constitution was written with them in mind. Since our founding, the citizenship class has only expanded, though not without great struggle, and the character of our republic has only become more firmly entrenched. Our culture, our economy, our whole theory of freedom is premised on the dignity and power of the working man and woman. Ours is a middle-class republic. And to preserve the American nation means to preserve the security and prosperity of this American middle. This imperative forms the basis of our interests in the world. We seek an international order where we can practice our unique way of democracy. We seek an international order that will allow our working people to prosper and to maintain their political and economic independence. And of course, we seek an order where the country our people call home is physically safe and physically secure. We are today a vast continental nation, and our middle class is large, and to enable its prosperity, we manufacture and we trade, and not only among ourselves, but with others beyond our borders. Our middle class character makes us a commercial nation, and for that reason, a trading nation too. And so American interests are inseparably bound up with access to other regions of the world on open and equal terms. American security requires that this nation be free to seek out commercial partners and free to negotiate with those partners for terms favorable to all sides. But we can only pursue those ends if no region of the world, if no key area vital to us is dominated or controlled by another power. As Americans, we have long defined political liberty at home as freedom from domination. That is the theory of our Constitution, and it should be the keystone of our foreign policy abroad. We seek an international system that is free from hegemonic rule, free from suzerainty or control by any one state. We seek an international system where nations can make their own choices, where they can meet on a level field, where they can control their own destinies. This has long been our ambition in the world. When this nation was still in its infancy and our borders did not yet span the continent, the Monroe Doctrine announced our intention to prevent any foreign power from exercising hegemony, dominance in our hemisphere. For this hemisphere was then the region of signal importance to our security. In the First and Second World Wars, our aims were similar. This nation took up arms in places far from home to stop imperial powers from seizing control of Europe and Asia. And the same logic guided America's hand through the Cold War. Across administrations, this nation pursued strategies and alliances to stop the Soviet Union from dominating Europe and Asia and ultimately the globe. And we succeeded. Amid this history, of course, America pursued its own experiment with imperialism. Thankfully, the American people rejected that policy, and this nation has rightly renounced imperial ambitions. We should be clear that imperial domination violates our principles, and it threatens our character. Our aim must be to prevent imperialism, not exercise it, to stop domination, not foster it. And now we must gird ourselves for a new effort, because new challenges wait and new dangers rise, and in the world's most critical of regions, the Indo-Pacific. It is here in Asia that the great security challenges of the 21st century are now playing out, and it is here that any policy centered on American interests must focus. This region, this sprawling expanse with diverse peoples and cultures and nations is critical for our trade, critical for our jobs, critical for our national welfare. And today, this is the region where the menace of hegemony looms largest. It is surely evident to everyone in this room that the once free and open Indo-Pacific is increasingly less so. In this critical region at this critical moment, the People's Republic of China gathers strength by the day, intervening in the affairs of its neighbors, distorting and manipulating commerce and capital to extract as much as it can, while giving as little as possible in return. And it's not just about trade and investment. It's not only about programs like the Belt and Road Initiative, which seek to bend the wealth of the world to the Chinese Communist Party. It's far more than that. China brazenly bullies our allies and partners, aggressively militarizes rocks in the sea, and openly seeks control of the entire region. We see this in Hong Kong, where promises are broken and violence escalates and basic liberties are restricted or just brazenly ignored. We see it in Taiwan, where a free people stand fast against a power bent on erasing their independent identity. We see it even in our own corporations like Disney and the NBA, who throw overboard free speech at the first sign of Beijing's commercial pressure. And when it comes to commerce, it is true. China buys our products. It is also true that they have given us a degree of market access. But for years, this growing commercial relationship with China has concealed another and inconvenient truth. Our producers and our workers are increasingly at the mercy of the Chinese Communist Party. China is building its own military and economic power on the backs of our working class. This reality has been right in front of us for those who have cared to look. Over 3 million manufacturing jobs left our shores in the first dozen years of this century due to China, devastating families and gutting communities in places far from this town. Our workers have known for years what this city is only just beginning to discover, that the Beijing regime will first take from you and then replace you the second it gets the chance. China's drive for regional hegemony is a clear and present danger. At every juncture that China has grown in strength, so too has its government's willingness to weaponize and leverage and project its power. China's bid for domination is the greatest security threat to this country in this century. And our foreign policy around the globe must be oriented to this challenge and focus principally on this threat. Our efforts to counter jihadism, to stem the proliferation of deadly weapons, to curb rogue regimes, and to protect valued partners like Israel, these priorities are essential and they remain in America's interests. Now we must address them in light of the challenge of China's bid for mastery in Asia and beyond. For this is more than a contest between economic competitors. It's much more than a rivalry. This is a bid for mastery by an authoritarian and imperial state that we fundamentally cannot trust and that we fundamentally cannot ignore. And so we must adapt and change to answer this new reality. That means strengthening our ties with our existing allies and partners in the region, those maritime democracies who have historically kept this region open and free. It means seeking out new partners like India, who share our interests, and even old foes like Vietnam, who share our needs. It means a robust physical presence in key strategic places to sustain regional deterrence. And it means countering malign Chinese influence in other arenas, from Africa to Latin America to our colleges and universities here at home. And importantly, it means evaluating our current range of commitments to ensure that this challenge has the attention and resources it needs at this crucial time to succeed. American might is not limitless, and nor are the lives and the treasure of the American people. Now we must make hard choices and articulate clear priorities in order to meet the challenge before us. Now let me be clear. Our task is not to remake China from within. Rather, it is to deny Beijing's ability to impose its will without, whether it be upon Hong Kong or Taiwan or our allies and partners or upon us. We cannot remake every nation in our image, but what we can do is act in a manner that reflects America's character. By resisting the tyranny of domination by any one state in any one region, we protect our way of life, we improve the station of our friends, and we support freedom-loving people everywhere. I tell you today that our foreign policy can change. It must change. It is time we faced facts and addressed the world as it is. And it is time our foreign policy honored this nation's unique history and reflected its unique character. To those who advocate for withdrawal and isolation, I say that will not keep Americans safe and prosperous. Ours must be a foreign policy for the people who built this country, one that honors our workers by protecting their livelihoods, protects our way of life by thwarting hegemons, and respects our service members by asking them to sacrifice only for a justified purpose and only with a reasonable plan. Our purpose in the world is informed by our character at home and by our enduring aspiration to be a free people. Our unique way of democracy is a gift to us and to the world. Now we must rise to defend it again in our day. By championing a free and open international system, by striving for a world free from domination and imperialism, we do our part to carry forward our revolutionary inheritance. Our nation will be safer for it, our people will be more prosperous for it, and the world will be better because of it. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Senator, thanks so much for your thoughtful and comprehensive comments. I thought one of the most interesting aspects of this was your connection between the middle class and what the people in places like Missouri care about in terms of their physical protection, their prosperity, their basic freedoms, and what we're trying to do in the rest of the world. And of course, this is kind of one of the overarching questions of our time about how do you orient a foreign policy toward that. So maybe I ask you to start by spelling out a little bit about what you're worried about specifically with China. So if Asia is dominated by China, we know that does to the allies over there. We know that does to the partners. What does that do to the people who are living in the United States who, don't really want to think about China every day? What does that world look like?
It's a great question. I think a vitally important one. What it does is that it means that we cannot continue the prosperity of our middle and working class. I mean, period. China, the Indo-Pacific, is a region that is absolutely vital to us. We have to be able to trade in that region. We have to be able to have access to that region on free and equal terms. We don't need to dominate that region. We shouldn't. We don't need to act as a hegemon. We should not. But we do have to have access for the basic character of this country to continue. Our middle class, our working class right now is under very significant pressure. This is much the theme of our domestic politics. We cannot afford a world in which we are shut out of the world's largest, fastest growing regions and markets, or in which we are relegated to a status in which we cannot, on free and equal terms, trade and pursue commercial relationships. So for the security and prosperity of our working and middle classes, we have to have access to that region.
And that actually brings me to your criticism of private companies like Disney and NBA. And the response from corporations will be, or at least some of these corporations, hey, look, this is the biggest consumer market in the world. There's a price to have access to that, self-censorship, apologizing for a random tweet from the general manager of the Houston Rockets, whatever it is. It just kind of goes with the territory. What do you want us to do? We are a corporation that is aimed at maximizing shareholder value. That's a big market. We get revenue from there. We're not politicians. We're not foreign policy makers. How do you think that companies like that should deal with these problems, which are starting now, but they're going to continue into the indefinite future?
Absolutely. What we've seen with the NBA, Disney, and others is, I think, a preview of coming attractions. And what I want them to do is not become arms of the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda machine. And I think what we're seeing is, what we have to realize is that Beijing's desire to dominate the region is of a piece with their desire to tell American companies what they can and cannot say. By the way, it's also of a piece with their desire to gather as much information and data, sensitive data if possible, on Americans, on an American foreign policy interest as they can with companies like TikTok, or to coerce our companies, our data companies like Google, like Apple, to share data with them, with the Chinese Communist Party and with Beijing. So what Beijing is aiming for, and they've been very clear about this, so what they are aiming for is regional domination, and beyond that, access, influence, if not control, of the international system. And the way that they're treating American companies is part of that. So I would just say to these American companies, you're going to have to draw the line. It's fine to do business in China. We need access to that region and to their markets. But what you must not do is allow Beijing to start to make you an arm of their government, because that's exactly what Beijing has done with the corporate sector, the business sector in their own country. and we cannot allow them to do that with that sector and ours.
I'm curious what you're hearing from your constituents back home. So there were some of us from CNS who were in Kansas City a few months ago. We only stayed on the Missouri side, so we didn't even cross the state line. It was
the right thing
great
to do.
place.
Good job.
And one of the things that I was struck by was actually when we met with representatives of the farmers out there who couldn't sell their soybeans to China. And this is a few months ago, but at least it was striking to me that they were not clamoring for just make all this trouble go away. It was actually a sense that this was a piece of a much bigger issue and that they were going to play their part, and there may be some short-term pain associated with that. Now, who knows how long that kind of goes. But when you talk to your constituents in Missouri, are people worried about China beyond economics? Are they worried about the illiberalism? Are they worried about the geographic sort of domination? How do they sort of square this with their other concerns like terrorism and everything else that they worry about?
This is an issue, an area where I think normal, everyday working Americans have had a sense of this, an understanding of this, that, as I said in my remarks, is in many ways ahead, I think, of where the chattering class in this town has been. I have been hearing from Missourians for years about the danger of China. And they get it because they realize that China has taken our jobs, that China has engaged in unfair practices, that China has ripped off our middle class, stolen our property. They know that. You don't have to tell the American people that. They get that. It's in this town that people say, well, it's complicated. We can liberalize them. The American people, at least in Missouri, they've never believed that. They've always thought that China was a competitor. They have increasingly believed that China is behaving and competing unfairly, and they've always thought or long thought that China has bad intentions. And this is why when I go home and talk to people about my recent trip to Hong Kong, the situation in Hong Kong, they're not surprised. They're horrified, but they're not surprised. The people in Missouri are like, yeah, that doesn't surprise us at all, because we feel like that's the kind of intention they've been exhibiting towards us, our workers, our property, for a long time. In Missouri, they've been trying to, for instance, buy up farmland for quite a long time. China has. People are really worried about that. They're worried about the intentions of Beijing. And I go back to what I think is the fundamental point is that, listen, we don't need to seek conflict with China. We don't necessarily even need to contain, quote unquote, China. We need to make sure that China does not become an imperial power that dominates the region and the international system. That is our aim. That is a doable and achievable goal, and I think we should see it as part of a broader foreign policy that seeks to prevent hegemony by any power anywhere. But it is going to be hard work, and we're in for a long struggle, I think, in this century with China if they stay on their present course.
I want to ask you about your trip to Hong Kong in a minute, but before I do, just to connect this back to the sort of political resonance and things like that. So, you're in the beginning of your speech, you critiqued the sort of Universalist project. We're going to help make the world democracies everywhere. We're going to care about everything, no matter where it is. So if you're middle class American and you have been very, very articulate and outspoken on what's going on in Hong Kong, why should we care about what's happening in Hong Kong? It's a speck on the map. Whether Hong Kong is democratic or not, does that really affect the average middle-class person in the United States? Why should they care about what happens there?
Great question. I think it is indicative, Hong Kong is indicative of what Beijing is capable of, what Beijing's intentions are, and what they want to do to everybody if they have a chance. I mean, first Hong Kong, then Taiwan, then the whole region, and then we get to what Beijing has already been sort of telegraphing, which is they want to shut us out of the region. I mean, they want a region and a system, an international system, that revolves around them, that has the characteristics of their government and their regime. And what is it, the line that the Chinese leadership likes to quote, there can only be one sun in the sky. That's a problem. That's a problem. It's a problem for our workers. It's a problem for our middle class. It's something that it's a threat to our security. It's a threat to our prosperity, and it's something we can't allow.
And maybe you could say a word. You were in Hong Kong a few weeks ago, meeting with protesters and wandering around a little bit.
That's right.
And maybe you could just say a little bit about what your takeaway was from that experience, and particularly given the news early this morning, our time, things seem to be going from bad to worse in terms of it doesn't seem to be any resolution, certainly, in any near term to this. So where do you think all of this is going in Hong Kong?
Yeah, I had the chance to go to Hong Kong last month and to see for myself. I went out on the streets myself to be there with the protesters, to see them, to see what was going on with the police, just to I applaud the news coverage, especially some of the really brave news coverage from reporters who are out there in violent and dangerous situations. So let me just take this opportunity to say thank you for the tremendous work that reporters from all over the world are doing in bringing this to the attention of the world. But I needed to see it for myself. So I went myself. I spent an evening out on the streets, and then another day meeting with protest leaders, people from a cross-section of Hong Kong society, pastors, social workers, et cetera, which was really fascinating. I just have to say that the sense in Hong Kong, and this was a month ago now, Richard, the sense then was that it was urgent. The situation was urgent. And what I said, which really infuriated the Hong Kong government, the pro-Beijing government, is that Hong Kong was becoming a police state. I mean, I saw it with my own eyes. Police violence that is not checked, that has no oversight, the inability, of course, of the residents of Hong Kong to elect their chief executive. Since I was there, Beijing has disqualified pro-democracy candidates for their district council elections, Joshua Wong being the primary example. And what we're seeing, I think, with the latest incident at the universities, I'm sure you've all seen the news from Hong Kong in the last few hours, the last 12 hours, about what's happening in their universities. It's really remarkable. I mean, it's terrible. And it is a sign, again, it is an indication, it is a demonstration of what Beijing intends and what Beijing is capable of. This is why I think it is vitally important that the United States Senate take up and pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. We have delayed long enough. We have waited long enough. That act should come to the floor and it should be voted upon. It is important that we send a signal to Beijing and to the world, including some of our, I'm afraid to say, too reluctant allies who want to say nothing about what's going on in Hong Kong. It is important we send a clear message that this is not acceptable and that China's intentions are not going to go unnoticed or unchecked.
And Hong Kong officials have been saying privately for months now that the protests just can't go on forever. This will peter out at some point. University students want to go back to school, or they want their weekends free again, or whatever. It sounds to me like your experience on the ground brought you the opposite view here. Is that right?
That's right. My impression was in meeting and seeing the protests, talking with them on the streets, protesters on the streets, and then meeting with them in person, is that they feel that this is an existential threat to the character of their city. Now, interestingly, what person after person told me is they believe in one country, two systems. The Hong Kong protesters are not the people who are the revisionists here. They just want the status quo ante. They want what they were promised in 1984 and then again in 1997 at the handover. They want the terms of the 1984 treaty to be followed through. That's all they're asking for. What they're trying to prevent is the steady rolling back of those promises, of those commitments, the violation of their basic law by Beijing. And again, I think this is why what's happening in Hong Kong is so indicative of the region. China's the revisionist power in the region, clearly. China is trying to alter the terms and balance of power in the region and ultimately in the international system. And we've got to do something about that.
And I'll say, for those who've worked at the State Department, the idea of a U.S. Senator in Hong Kong going out into the protests at night is the control officer and the RSO's worst nightmare. But good on you for going out and getting the ground truth.
Back.
Let me turn to one thing that was you mentioned in your speech about the trade-offs associated with focusing on the Indo-Pacific and the whole rest of the world. And of course, President Obama tried to pivot to Asia. President Trump has tried to get us out of the forever wars. I think today there are more American troops in the Middle East, greater Middle East, than there were at the beginning of the Trump administration. That President Obama ended up, bombing more countries in the Middle East than President Bush did. So for all of the intentions to sort of get out of the Middle East entanglements and focus on Indo-Pacific, it's been a real challenge. And part of the reason, obviously, is because we're worried about what the consequences of withdrawal should be. So if we take I guess it's now 800 troops that will remain in Syria, depending on which day of the decision making. Does ISIS come back? If we get out of Afghanistan, does Al Qaeda come back and use that as a sanctuary for terrorism and then launch attacks, including in the United States? Yeah. So how do you think about this balance between we want to end the forever wars and get out of these things and focus on this big game, but on the other hand, we don't want to let terror sanctuaries emerge and then it comes back to haunt precisely the kind of people that the foreign policy should be directed at protecting?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that part of what we have to do in the Middle East is focus. more closely on our key priorities there and be more single-minded about pursuing them. I would say the first of those is to counter terrorism and to prevent the formation and growth of terrorist networks and cells that can strike the United States or pose a direct and immediate threat to American interests. So counterterrorism is very much in our national interest. It is a key priority in that region and continues to be. Preventing any one nation, and Iran in particular, from becoming a regional hegemon. I mean, that, again, I think our whole foreign policy should be geared around preventing domination by any power in any regions of the globe. It's an anti-imperialist, anti-domination, anti-hegemonic foreign policy. That's what I think has been our historical practice. I think that's what we should return to. So we have a strong interest in making sure that the greater Middle East is not dominated by any one power, and Iran would be, I think, the most dangerous threat there. But those interests are very different, I think, than acting as the general guarantor of regional stability, whatever that might mean. And I think that we have drifted in that region, partly because we haven't had an overarching purpose globally for some time now. We haven't had a clear sense of mission, and also because I think we've slipped into thinking that, well, we can just do it all. I mean, we'll just ask the American taxpayer to write a larger check. We're going to spend almost $800 billion on defense this year. We cannot afford to spend $1 trillion or $2 trillion a year on defense. I mean, we just can't. This is why I say American might and American treasure are not limitless, and the American people are already footing a massive bill. Now listen, I am in favor of rebuilding our military. I think the previous administration cut back foolishly and unwisely, but there are limits. I mean, we cannot fund a $2 trillion a year military. We cannot do it all. We are not the only quote-unquote superpower in the world. The unipolar moment is over. Part of this means we're going to need more help from our allies in every region of the globe, including the Middle East, certainly in Europe, and absolutely in the Asia Pacific. So we have a lot of work to do.
And do you think, is it your sense that the counterterrorism mission in the Middle East, so let's take where there are troops now in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, that mission can be executed without an American presence, military presence in those countries?
Well,
or does ending the forever wars mean get out of some forms of combat but keep a residual presence of some number in those places?
Yeah, I would think that, our soldiers and the Joint Force have become, I think, incredibly good at, first of all, the Joint Force is amazingly good at what they do. I mean, they really are the best. They need more support, and part of giving them that support is for political leaders to give clear direction and to quit asking them to do everything all the time. But to counterterrorism, the Joint Force, I think, has become very, very good at counterterrorism, particularly using special forces. So my sense is we're probably going to need to continue a presence in the region because we cannot afford to permit terrorist cells that, again, have international reach, the ability to strike the American homeland or American interests. We cannot permit those to reform ISIS, Al-Qaeda, et cetera. But does that mean that we need large numbers of ground troops? I mean, to your point, we have more troops now than we did just a few years ago. I mean, that I think we've got to think very hard about that. We've got to think very hard about our footprint, and we've got to think very hard not just about troops, but what kind of troops, not just about equipment, what kind of platforms, and we've got to think about that in the context of our overall needs.
I'm going to ask one more question, then go to the audience to be thinking about your questions. And the final one I'll ask is Russia.
Right.
So how does Russia fit in to the foreign policy that you sketched out, both as a direct threat to the United States, whether it's military or through political meddling or through the violation of regional rules and so forth, and then also its connections with China? Should we worry about this Russia-China axis being formed? Should we try to peel Russia away? How do you sort of think about that?
Well, Russia also has its own aspirations, pretensions maybe, to hegemony, but they're a dangerous threat. And I say that the threat of hegemony looms largest in the Indo-Pacific, but it looms in the Baltics as well. It looms in Europe with a newly aggressive Russia. And so this has got to be, if China and the Indo-Pacific, I think, is our pacing threat and our pacing theater, Russia has got to be, I think, close behind. Now, this is an area where we need our NATO allies to do more. We need them. This is in their backyard. We cannot simultaneously, the United States cannot simultaneously lead the charge against Russian hegemony and Chinese hegemony in separate theaters all at the same time and pursue counterterrorism. And we just can't do all of that. So we need our NATO allies to step up and spend more and do more in Europe, in the Baltics in particular, where the fait accompli scenario with Russia, I think, is probably the signal security threat. We really need them to do more. Our alliances do matter. Alliances are going to be vitally important to us, my sense is, in this new era, precisely because this isn't a unipolar world anymore. But Germany in particular has absolutely got to do more in Europe. Because the truth is, if we are forced to choose between Europe and Asia, between the Russian threat and the Chinese threat, we're going to have to choose the Indo-Pacific. I mean, that is much more pressing for us and for our interests. We do not want to see Russia expansionist in Europe. That would be a disaster. But if we are forced to, we would have to choose the Indo-Pacific. We should not be put to that choice. And we've got to work with our allies to make sure that we're partnering together so that we can together do what we need to do to maintain stability and peace.
All right, I lied. I'm going to ask one last
Yeah, you
question,
bet.
one more question before we go to the audience, which, you very strikingly rejected the prevailing consensus on both the left and the right, and sketched out this sort of new way forward. You're the youngest senator. I think you're the newest senator.
Yeah.
Does that consensus exist among your colleagues in the Senate, or do they think like you?
No, I would say that consensus is still predominates everywhere that I have seen, and I think it's I think part of it may be generational, but I think that in many ways we still live with a Cold War hangover, maybe a post-Cold War hangover. We just celebrated the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is an amazing achievement, and I think there was such hope at the end of the Cold War and in the early to mid '90s that maybe the world was going to change fundamentally, and that great power politics would be maybe gone forever, and that we could completely rethink what the international system looks like. It just turns out that that's not the case. It turned out that Russia and China didn't get the memo. It turns out that the balance of power is back. It turns out that we are not the only powerful country in the world, and nor do we need to be. And this is part of my message. We don't need to be. We don't need a unipolar international system. The United States does not need to be the world's hegemon. We shouldn't be. Pursuing that would be incredibly expensive, and also, I think, really detrimental to our values in the long run. We don't need to do that. We just need to make sure that no hegemon, no imperial power comes to dominate any other region of the globe. And we can do that, and that, I think, is very much in accord with who we are and our long-term interests.
Great. Let's go to the audience. Raise your hand if you have a question. Identify yourself, and there are mics that will be coming around. Ali. Oh, okay. We'll go here, and then we'll go down.
Okay. Simon Gao with Zooming In and NTD TV. Senator, under your overarching foreign policy framework, I just want to confirm America would not assume the role of the leader of the free world. That's number one. Number two, regarding China, President Reagan said communism is like a virus. And I think with virus, we only have two ways to deal with it: either kill it or get away from it. And I think history has proven that, the market economy and American values are kind of vulnerable, dealing with the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, it has not been immune to the communist corruption. So if we engage China still, like the two economies still engage together, do you think the history, how can you make sure the history won't repeat itself?
Yeah, thank you for that. As to the first question, I very much see the United States as the leader of the free world. I believe in the free world, and I believe that our mission in the world is to help make the world more free and open. But I suggest that the way that we do that is not necessarily by seeking unipolarity. It's not by trying to create a world of democracies, which we ultimately cannot do. We should hope for such a world of democracies, absolutely. But the focus of our policy, I think, should be a little bit more realistic, and that is to try and prevent domination and hegemony. I think of this as a pro-democracy foreign policy, because it's one that's built on allowing our democracy to thrive, and hopefully allowing other states in the international system to have the same sort of freedom that we do in terms of making their own choices, seeking what's best for their people, not being dominated by any regional power. Your second point as to China is one that I agree with. This was part of, I think, of the hope of the foreign policy consensus on China for decades is that, well, including them in the WTO, enmeshing them in the international system would lead to the liberalization of China. Well, that hasn't happened. I mean, and far from it, right? So, if anything, we are importing, they are exporting to us, and we are importing their authoritarian values on speech, at least, and that's the danger with companies like Disney or entities like the NBA. So this is why I say we have to gird ourselves to a new era of competition with China, and we have to be ready to resist their attempts at regional hegemony. Now, that does not mean that we need to shut them off from the world, but it does mean that we cannot allow them to dominate the world or to dominate their region.
Hawley, right here.
Thank you very much, Senator Hawley. My name is Ali Wine. I'm a policy analyst with the RAND Corporation. Thank you so much for your remarks this morning. There's been a lot of talk in Washington and Beijing about decoupling or delinking our economy from that of China, and I just wonder, there's a vast, obviously, continuum between sort of our present configuration of interdependence and full-on decoupling. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what steps the United States might take in its relationship with China to preserve some beneficial trade and technological linkages, but mitigating some of the security dangers that interdependence poses. So what, maybe kind of an intermediate form of interdependence between our two countries, what might it look like?
Well, that's a great question. It's very much the question of the day. I was hoping that you were going to tell me when you finished your question. I think, though, that is the outcome that we should be pursuing. I mean, I think for those who say we've got to end our current trade conflict with China, which, by the way, we didn't start, but we've got to end it and go back to full and total integration. We've got to get back to the good old days. That's just not going to happen because Beijing won't let it happen, because Beijing's desire is for regional dominance and ultimately system dominance. So we're going to have to pursue some sort of separation enough that we are not held hostage effectively by their commercial power. And their commercial power is great, and it will only grow, I think. Part of that is we're going to have to pursue opening up other markets in the region and closer ties with other nations there. I mean, I talked about India, for example. It's a large market increasingly coming online. It's going to have hopefully a growing middle class. So we're going to have to, with our partnerships and alliances, India, Japan, the Philippines, places like Vietnam, others, certainly South Korea, we're going to have to try and expand our access there, but ultimately pressure China to grant free and open terms, ones that are not coercive. What exactly does that look like? I don't know, but I will say I think the full complement of policy tools need to be on the table. And again, for those who hope for a day when we're no longer in this sort of competitive / confrontational economic stage with China, I just don't think we're going back. So the question for all of you in the room who are experts in these fields is what sort of policy tools are we going to develop to continue to pursue our interests, which are, again, to deter Chinese aggression and expansion, but also to make sure that we have the access we need for our workers.
We got a few ideas on that, so watch this space.
Okay, excellent.
Constanza, over here.
Hi, my name is Constanze Stelzenmüller from Brookings, and I am German, and I'm with you on the Europeans and the Germans needing to do more, no contest. However, there are those in this town who think that the EU is an imperial hegemonic power. Is that the view you take?
Is that my take, did you say?
Is that your take, yes?
No, not really. I mean, I don't, so my concern with, I think that I would like the EU to, when it comes to our own trade disputes with them, and I'm from a farming state, so we have some bones to pick with how our farmers have been treated by the EU. So we hope for better and fairer terms. But from a military national security perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, I don't see the EU as they're not the threat. If there's a threat to the balance of power in the European theater, it's not the EU, it's Russia. And so I think that we need our European allies to do more with us. We cannot come to a situation in which the United States is forced to choose. I just think that would be bad for everybody involved.
Gentleman right over here.
I'm very much interested in the Middle East.
Just wait for the microphone.
About Iran, you talked about counterterrorism also. There is one piece that I would like you to have some comments on is Turkey. Are they still essential in the NATO? What do you make of the relationship in between the administration and the president of Turkey and his visit tomorrow to the White House?
Well, obviously they're still a part of NATO. Richard asked earlier, and I didn't address it, but you asked about Russia and China. That is, and I worry about Turkey and Russia. So the Russia-China friendship, I think, would be disastrous for us, and we do need to be very, very concerned about any potential warm, growing alliance there, growing partnership. That I think would be very, very bad. Similarly, I worry about Turkey moving towards Russia's orbit, and that has got to be for us, I think, a project of trying to prevent any further gravitational pull towards Moscow. And we're going to need, I mean, listen, the situation recently in Turkey with Syria shows, I think, the need for to call upon our alliances and our friends. I mean, this is interesting. Something that I think I can say this. Something that our generals have reported is that their view as to why the security zone in northern Syria proved to be unstable and we were not able to hold it is that it was never actually a political solution. It was a military one. In other words, our military devised sort of this area. Our military tried to get the buy-in of the Turkish military and the Kurdish military, but there was never actually any political buy-in. This, I think, is symptomatic of our issues in the region as a whole, where we have relied too much, perhaps, on military power, hard military power, and not worked enough on the political side of things. And we're going to have to do more of that in the Middle East, not less, and in the greater region, not less, as we train our military focus toward the Indo-Pacific, and then secondarily toward the Baltics. So I think, again, we've got a lot of work to do, but getting our priorities clear is, I think, is an important step. But to your overarching question, I worry about Turkey and Russia a lot.
Yes, ma'am. This lady right here in the second row.
Thank you, Senator. Katie Wang with NTD. I have two questions. First, you mentioned about this Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act.
Right.
Actually, we have seen it past the House floor and also the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But can you give us some insights why it's still pending, not being voted on the floor? And the second question is, a couple of days ago is the 30th anniversary of this fall of the Berlin Wall. And some of your colleagues in the Congress and Senate call Hong Kong the new Berlin because they maybe see it as a new potential, turning point. So I'm just wondering what's your take on that? And do you think that the Western democracy have given enough support to Hong Kong? Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for those questions. Just to take the second one, I do think that Hong Kong is the Berlin of this generation in the sense that it captures and makes vivid the struggle that this generation is going to have, which is with an increasingly martial and expansionist China. And that's what we're seeing play out in Hong Kong. China is not willing to allow the status quo to exist in Hong Kong. China's trying to change that, and it's trying to do it by imposing its power and imposing its will. And it's trying to use Hong Kong, I think, to send a signal to the whole region of what they're going to do, and that you'd better get on board with Beijing because look at what Beijing is capable of. And certainly we know that this is what they want to do with Taiwan and others. Ultimately, China doesn't want to have military conflict if they can avoid it. What they want to do is get everybody in the region afraid of them by showing what they're capable of doing. And I think that's part of what's happening in Hong Kong, which is why it's so important and why I've called it the Berlin of this generation. As to your first question, I don't know why we're not voting on the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. I'd like to know the answer to that too. So I hope that we'll vote this week. I don't know why we're not. I've been calling for it for weeks. I've introduced my own bill to impose Magnitsky sanctions, which I think are called for and very much in order. So I hope we'll vote soon.
And we'll give the last question to this gentleman in the first row here.
Thank you, Senator. I'm Satoshi Nishata from the Liberty Magazine and Happy Science Group. I'm very impressed by your visiting Hong Kong to get the situation firsthand. I'm very, very impressed by your courage. Regarding China's intention or ambition for world hegemony, what do you think could be the most effective way to deter or stop China's expansionism? For example, the President Reagan's way to collapse Soviet Union, I think that worked very well. So what do you think about China? Thank you.
Yeah, but that is, again, I think very much the question of the day. What, in terms of our military posture, we're going to have to adopt a posture forward in the region. So I think that if you look at the various military scenarios, again, China doesn't want to have to fight a military conflict. I mean, you say whatever you want about Beijing. They're extremely sophisticated. They are outstanding planners, and they have been pursuing, the Communist Party leadership, have been pursuing this plan for quite some time. So what they want to do is convince everybody that they can exert their power and that therefore everybody should kowtow to Beijing. I think that we need to focus in particular on Taiwan. I think Taiwan really is likely to become the flashpoint here, and the focus of our military efforts as the National Defense Strategy lays out, I think is right in this respect. The focus of our military planning efforts have to be to prevent a fait accompli scenario in Taiwan. You know, China has studied our way of war, the American way of war from the last couple of decades. They know that in the Indo-Pacific, because of the vast distances involved, we cannot surge troops into theater quickly, to put it mildly. So if China is able to seize Taiwan, we will have, and we're not there to hinder it or to halt it, we and our allies, then it will be a fait accompli. That's the scenario, I think, that has got to be at the top of our planning to prevent. And we need to make it clear that we are able to prevent it. There's a lot that we need to do in order to get there. We're going to have to change our military posture in the region. We're going to have to build networks and alliances, because it can't be just us. We need our partners and allies in the region to come and be part of this project. And it needs to be clear to Beijing that if they're going to attempt to strike at Taiwan, they will be resisted by the United States and by a network of allies and partners. And it will force them, they will be in for a very big fight that the international community will not support them with. I think that has got to be the focus of our military planning efforts. And much of the rest diplomatically, I think, flows from that in the building out of our alliances, in the building out of our partnerships. And there's a lot of work there to do. It's doable. We can do it. But we have a lot of work to do, and there's not a second to waste.
Well, that's a good note to wrap this conversation up on. Senator, you've covered a lot of territory, very thoughtful comments. We thank you for coming and being with us today and sharing your thoughts on all these matters. And please join me in thanking Senator Josh Hawley.
Thank you. Thank you so much.